Okay.
Go ahead and record, Mr. Chair.
Yes, please. We're ready to go.
Okay, we're now recording.
Thank you. I'll call the meeting to order. This is the May 25, 2021 meeting of the Town Plan and Zoning Commission for the Town of Fairfield. The first item, we have, who is next on the alternate list to sit for Commissioner Noonan?
That is an excellent question. Didn't expect to need it to the best of my knowledge, and you guys can correct. I think it's Mr. Elliott, but I'm not 100% sure.
Very good, sir.
All right.
You were here at the last meeting.
No, I wasn't, but I watched it.
You watched it. Fantastic. Yep. Excellent. You will sit for Commissioner Noonan this evening.
All right.
So the first item on our agenda are bills and communications, the meeting minutes. We have two, one from May 11th and one from May 12th.
Move to approve.
Okay, motion
May
to approve.
11th.
Motion to approve by May 11th minutes by Commissioner Francis, second by Commissioner Brayman. Any comments or questions, corrections? I didn't see anything here.
There's one, Mr. Chairman, that Mr. Brayman pointed out under the closed executive session.
Yep, we'll get there. We'll get there. This is on the May 11.
Correct.
Oh, May 11. Very good. Yep.
Under the closed executive session, that says no motions were made and decisions were rendered. It should say or. No motions were made or decisions were rendered in closed session.
Agreed.
So that and should be an or, and I thank Mr. Brayman for his editorial eyes.
Agreed. Okay, with that change then, any other questions or comments? I thought we were talking about the planning one, but thank you, Commissioner Brayman. All those in favor say aye. Aye, raise your hand. Yep. Any opposed? Abstentions? The minutes as amended are adopted unanimously. Next is May 12th.
Move to approve.
Commissioner Francis moves to approve. Second by Commissioner Brayman. Thank you. Any questions, comments, or corrections to these minutes? No, I agree. I didn't see anything here either. Okay. All in favor, say aye. Raise your hand. Aye. Any opposed? Okay, Kathy. Kathy, you're in favor, yes?
I was in favor.
Yeah, thank you. Any opposed? Any abstentions? So the May 12 minutes are approved unanimously as well. The next item is new applications to recommend a public hearing. The first is 45 Sherman Street, special permit application of 45 Sherman Street LLC for a second floor dormer addition for an existing commercial building in the Center Design District.
Mr. Chairman, I don't really have anything more beyond this. It is a small commercial building on Sherman Street that is a special permit and does require a public hearing.
Very good. Thank you. Public hearings required. Can I have a motion? So moved, Commissioner Braun. Second by Commissioner Elliott. Excellent. Thank you, Commissioner Elliott. Any further questions or comments?
What business is it, please?
Well, it's in transition. It's a house. There's two structures on the property. There's an old house that has this an apartment on the second floor, office on the first floor, excuse me, and a detached garage that was approved for conversion for office use. It was an accountant's office. I think it's transitioning to an insurance office, and they're looking to put a dormer addition on the second floor of the detached building.
Excellent, thank you.
And has enough off-street parking for what they want to do?
There's an existing variance in place for when it was transitioned, but otherwise, yes.
Okay. And does a variance go with the sale of the property?
Yes.
Okay. Any other questions? Motion is to move it to public hearing. All those in favor say aye or raise your hand. Any opposed? Well, that's unanimous, so there are no opposition, there's no one opposed, and there's no abstention. The item is moved to public hearing unanimously. Next is 323 Old Dam Road, special exception and coastal site plan application of Esplanade LLC pertaining to the construction of a single-family dwelling in the floodplain district.
Mr. Chairman, this is a special exception by virtue of the fact that it is in a floodplain district off of Old Dam Road, and as such, it does require a public hearing. It's for the construction of a single-family dwelling.
Okay, very good. Public hearing is required.
It is.
Can I have a motion, please? Commissioner Braun, so moved. Thank you. Commissioner Francis, second. Any other questions? All those in favor say aye. Raise your hand. Any opposed? Nobody's opposed. No abstentions. The item is moved to public hearing unanimously. Next is 898 Oldfield Road, zoning compliance and coastal site plan application of 888 Oldfield LLC pertaining to a 13-unit residential development pursuant to section 830G of the Connecticut General Statutes in the residential B zone.
Mr. Chairman, these are two side-by-side properties that each have a single-family residence. Just locationally, it's on the north side of Oldfield Road, about 3 lots east of South Pine Creek Road. And the proposal is for a 13-unit residential development under the Affordable Housing Statute.
Very good. Can I have a motion, please? So move Commissioner Levy, thank you. And second, Commissioner Elliott. So we have another 830G here, residential zone. Do you know how many stories is proposed?
They are, I believe these are townhouse units with garage on three stories, 2 occupied floors above garages for each of the units.
In a townhouse style?
Correct.
Any other comments or questions? Moving to public hearing. Okay, all those in favor say aye, raise your hand. Any opposed? Any abstentions? Item is moved to public hearing unanimously. The next item on the agenda is old business, and we have zoning regulation amendments. The application of 15 Uncle Road LLC to amend sections 12 and 28 of the zoning regulations.
Mr. Chairman, I was notified late this afternoon that this application has been withdrawn by the applicant.
Very good. Well, we still have noticed a planning session at the end of our agenda, which is fortuitous, and thank staff for doing it that way, so that we can continue to discuss the possible amendment to our regulations for the center design district, and in an effort to consider taking action on our own accord to amend the regulations in that district, carrying forward the work that we did over the last several years. So we'll continue to do that, even though this application has been withdrawn. The next is 801 Post Road, special permit application of Samuel Gardner, architect, pertaining to additions and alterations to establish a restaurant use in the design commercial district.
Mr. Chairman, this, as I did forward a letter to the commission earlier today, this applicant has also withdrawn the application.
Very good. And we have 2 compliance applications left on the agenda. The first is 105 Woodrow Avenue, zoning compliance application of Dr. Jessica Melman to establish a veterinary hospital in a portion of an existing commercial building in the design commercial district.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, this property is located on the corner of Woodrow Avenue and Kings Highway West, and you're in the link in the agenda materials. We sent you some materials with that. There's an existing two-story office building on this site and a paved parking lot that's striped for 14 spaces. The applicant seeks to utilize the first floor of the building for a veterinary hospital, which is a permitted use in the design commercial district. Parking for such a use is the same as that as a professional office, so this change of use does not require any additional parking. The applicant, however, is proposing to restripe their lot. As it's striped now, the lot, the spaces are wider than what our regulations require as a minimum. So they presented a plan that they can restripe it to get 16 parking spaces, so 2 additional beyond what exists, including a very small paving addition to accommodate a handicap space. There are existing concrete sidewalks and driveway aprons that will remain. So it's really an interior use change, no exterior change to the building to establish a veterinary use, which is listed separately as business and professional offices in the zone, but otherwise a permitted use.
Very good. Can I have a motion on this item? So moved, Commissioner Braun, and seconded by Commissioner Francis. Thank you. Mr. Went, does the application otherwise comply with our regulations?
Yes, sir, it does.
Thank you. Very good. Commissioner Braun, any comments?
There's no change. This goes along with our parking requirements. They're just restriping it. But they didn't have to have that few spaces to begin with.
I'm not sure about the second part of that, but they're not. The only thing they're doing is restriping the lot, and it will yield 2 more spaces than they presently have.
Right.
But
that's adequate parking for the purpose.
Right. The change in use doesn't trigger the need for any additional space.
Okay, thanks.
And so to the point, they were in compliance with parking requirements previously.
And they still will be now.
Correct.
Okay.
Commissioner Francis? No comments? Very good. You're on mute. I was reading your lips.
It seems that it complies with all our regulations, and that's my only concern.
Right. Excellent. Commissioner Brayman?
Not that this is pertinent, but it seems to fulfill a need in the community for veterinary services.
Mm-hmm. Very good. Commissioner Corcoran, a thumbs up? Very good. I'll note that for the record.
Thumbs up on the need for veterinary services. A lot of them, the practices are closed right now.
Yeah. Well, kind of got hit in the pandemic with all the changes. Very good. My view is that the application complies with all of our regulations. It is, a permitted use in the zone. It is also serving a needed service in the community. I agree. Okay, ready to vote? All in favor, raise your hand or say aye. Any opposed? Any abstentions? No. Very good. The compliance is approved unanimously. Next item is 937 Post Road zoning compliance application of Zenaptica Corp. to convert existing second floor office space to 2 residential apartments in the design commercial district.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, this property is on the southerly side of the Post Road adjacent to Midas Muffler, and it backs up to the westerly end of the Bob Store Plaza. This building sits back to the rear of its property with the parking out in front. It's an existing 3-story building. On the ground floor, there are 2 existing restaurants. There's sports pub on the left-hand side, and I think a Peruvian restaurant on the right-hand side. Presently, the second floor are 2 offices, and then there are existing already 2 apartments on the 3rd floor. The application seeks to establish convert basically what are office space on the second floor to 2 residential apartments. The apartments would be approximately 1,000 and 1,200 feet respectively. They'd match the floor plans of the third floor space above them. Since the percentage of the residential occupancy would exceed 50% of the total floor area, the applicants sought and received approval for a variance to allow a 2/3 residential to commercial occupancy here. There's no exterior building or site plan changes. There's actually a reduction in the parking count by 6 for the 2 apartments occupancy versus the office space that had preceded the proposed use. That is all I have at this point, Mr. Chairman, unless there's any questions.
Commissioner Francis.
I had one question. Are the 4 spaces for the 4 apartments, or I think it was 8 spaces, right, for 4 apartments?
Two per, correct.
Yeah. Are they going to be marked?
I don't believe they're marked presently. There are 2 existing apartments there that have been there since this building was built. I don't believe they have assigned spaces. I don't believe that's been an issue, but I don't know to the extent that they plan to mark them for these 2 new apartments.
Is 17 parking spaces enough for the 2 restaurants?
I don't recall, frankly, whether when there may have been a variance. The restaurants have been there for so long that they've changed over certain occupancies, but I don't know the answer to that question, or don't recall whether there were variances granted or not.
They may be takeout mainly too. Okay, yeah, that was my only concern, was that the people are going to have spaces, but I suppose they'll be there at 6 a.m. if they're staying home that day or working from home, so. All right.
Well, the number of parking spaces complies with our regulations, given the usage of the property, correct?
Correct. The present use of the property actually requires more spaces than does the proposed use. The only thing that this change needed relief of the regulations was for the percentage of residential occupancy at 2/3 of the building, which exceeds the 50% current limit.
Right. Okay. Yeah. The letter of intent was a little ambiguous about having obtained necessary waivers from the Zoning Board of Appeals for the submitted plans. So it's not really a waiver. They obtained a variance for the percentage of residential space.
Correct.
Okay. And, taking into account the variances that were granted by ZBA, the plans otherwise comply with our regulations.
Yes, sir.
That's what I thought. Okay. Other questions? Comments? Okay, seeing none. Motion is to approve. All in favor, say aye or raise your hand. Sorry.
I'm not sure we had a motion on that, Mr. Chairman.
I'm so sorry, and that's why we always take a motion before we begin discussion. Commissioner Francis, you raised your hand, and I said so, but you didn't actually move.
All right, move to approve.
Motion to approve by Commissioner Francis, second by Commissioner Brayman. Thank you very much. All right. Now there's been a motion. All those in favor say aye, raise your hand. Looks like everyone. Thank you. Any opposed? Any abstentions? The compliance is approved unanimously. Thank you, everyone. That concludes our executive session for new matters and old business. The last item on our agenda is our planning discussion. And this was intended to be more of a discussion of the proposed amendments from 15 Uncle Road, but be that as it may, they've withdrawn, so perhaps we have a little bit more flexibility to consider our efforts in planning the work that we've done for the last couple of years. And Mr. Wendt, Ms. Harrigan, you were going to present some.
Yeah, so let me, I'll cue this up, Mr. Chairman. When we had a couple weeks ago, our planning discussion on the then pending amendments, you know, in the aftermath of that discussion, we thought it would be beneficial, and we did send you some links that we had hoped that you would look at for those of you that were on the journey with us for that planning effort in the public outreach that ensued. We thought it would be beneficial to walk through that a little bit in realizing that there were a couple of you that weren't with us at that time. So hopefully those links for the entire planning process that we undertook were helpful to you. We have prepared a subset of that material that Emmeline is going to walk us through that is pertinent to the center. I mean, obviously there was a major focus of that TOD study was on the Metro Center area and the Black Rock, you know, over in the Commerce Drive, but there was a substantial discussion about the center. So we culled that information out separately from all of those presentations, and we thought it would be beneficial to walk through that with you, and then we can discuss when we're done with that, discuss the regulatory scheme and how you might feel about that going forward. So with that, I think Emmeline's going to share the screen and walk through a PowerPoint.
Okay, thanks, Jim. Can you guys hear me okay? Just move my mic a little closer. Let's see, how are we advancing? Oh, there we go. Okay, so if we take you back to the TOD study, one of the reasons why we chose to hire a consultant to look at transit-oriented development in Fairfield is, I think as Jim mentioned a few meetings ago, a majority of Fairfield's land is zoned residential. And we were hearing a lot from both new commissioners at that time, as well as members of the community, in conjunction with some of the strategic planning work that was being done, that, you know, our residential property owners expressed a desire to hopefully decrease some of the tax burden on residential property owners, hopefully incentivize some new development within our commercial corridors. And so we kind of initiated the study with that understanding that there's not that much commercial property, and we really need to kind of position ourselves to develop it in context, wisely, and you know, maximize the potential that's there. So we really focused this study, although Fairfield does have 3 train stations. Obviously, Southport is a limited service station. It's much different in scale. And so the study really focused on 2 areas, Fairfield downtown and also Fairfield Metro, that these are really kind of our 2 biggest opportunities.
Just before you,
Yep, go
I'm
ahead,
sorry,
I'll go back.
before you move off of that slide, I just wanted to emphasize that it was understood that it was going to take unique strategies, as it says on this slide, that we weren't looking to implore or apply whatever strategies for the metro area to the downtown. We understood from the beginning that they were unique geographies that would take different approaches. So from the onset, that was part of the discussion. Sorry.
Thanks, Jim. No, that's fine. And then, so for each of the station areas, you know, the focus was a bit on what the walkability to certain areas were. In some of the discussion with the Fairfield downtown station area, obviously the Exide site is one of the primary properties that will be in play in the near future. You know, now that it's finished with its environmental remediation. That's kind of at the outer limits of the walkshed for most TOD planning studies, but from a residential perspective, a 15-minute walk, home without having to kind of get in your car is actually really quite pleasant, as long as the area that you walk through is vital and exciting, which we feel that, a lot of Fairfield downtown is. And so, in terms of thinking about downtown, again, it harkens back to, kind of looking at the context of what's there, wanting to appropriately alter our regulations to support infill in the kind of ways that we would want to see it. The workshops that we held were actually really well attended. I don't know if you can see the bottom slide from Penfield Pavilion, but these were very robustly attended meetings, very enthusiastic participants. There were hands-on activities, looking at the maps, discussing the potential parcels where infill might be appropriate. So this was a very robust public participation project. Two of our biggest meetings, the first one was held in June. And, what was kind of interesting is that this was really, the community really kind of came together to talk about these areas, understanding that they're both important to Fairfield, but a lot of folks didn't actually live in the study areas. So, this was kind of a Fairfield-wide participation in terms of folks really being interested and wanting to engage in the conversation. Folks were definitely interested in new development. I think people understood that mixed use and housing would be something that would need to be added to, or at least incentivized to add more to both of the station areas. Folks talked a lot about senior housing opportunities, also affordability, wanting to enhance in Metro Center, but also protect some of the pedestrian connectivity in downtown. And then also, of course, as comes up with most projects that we talk about, traffic and parking related concerns. People feel very positive that the downtown is already pretty walkable. Metro certainly has a ways to go in terms of kind of getting there. But, I think what we heard was that, there's, I think the focus for downtown is how do we add to, not subtract from. Part of the question, I think, in doing the study was to really look at, I think there's this perceived notion that multifamily housing, it actually has a lot of service demands on communities. And so our consultants spent a lot of time looking at feasibility in terms of, what's the tax revenue of multifamily and mixed use developments relative to the services that they would require. And, so they did find that multifamily housing does offer overwhelmingly positive fiscal impacts. I know that oftentimes when people talk about multifamily housing, the first thing people say, oh, the school kids. And study after study, in different parts of the country, and certainly our own data that we get from Fairfield Public Schools shows that multifamily developments have very low student populations. So, they're not, it's really detached single family homes that contribute the lion's share of students to school districts. And this is a nationwide trend. The other thing, and this of course came up in Metro Center where, we're kind of building that neighborhood, was once you get people in, it attracts some of those other uses and it helps stabilize some of those other retail, service, and office uses. That there is a nexus between the two. There's a symbiotic relationship. So adding more mixed use and more housing to our downtown and our Metro Center areas is beneficial. There's a beneficial relationship. In downtown, of course, being very sensitive to the context of what's there, I think was a focus. In terms of talking about TOD and the regulations, which is what we're kind of focusing on today, it's really kind of thinking about, well, what do you want to see there? How do you regulate the development through looking at the bulk? So what's the minimum size lot that you would like to work with? How much coverage do you want to allow? Floor area, and I know the board has already started to kind of talk about this, required setbacks. Do you want these structures to be have zero setback to each other so that you have a very consistent street edge. How far do you want them set back from the sidewalk to engage the pedestrian or to allow other uses such as outdoor dining? So these are all things I think that you think about when you think about walkable centers as well as transit-oriented development. The other primary focus was density, and the transit-oriented development study talked about that both in terms of what is a feasible project, both from a development perspective, and also what's the density that you need in terms of unit mix, what maximizes the potential of a site, and then how do you achieve that in the height in terms of the limit of feet and the number of stories that you allow within an area. And this gets to, I think, the initial proposal that talks about that first floor and the added height in the first floor, and then the residential upper stories can be a little bit shorter. Also parking requirements, do we overpark right now based on what we require of multifamily and mixed use projects? So, that was part of the discussion in terms of the center design business district and then the adjacent designed business district adjacent to that in proximity to the train station. The other part of why we had such a strong and heavy focus on mixed use is, we understand that millennials, they have a stronger tendency for renting rather than owning. Part of that is based upon their own financial circumstances. So, the TOD study really talked about that in terms of the existing burden for younger people in terms of student loan debt. So that was part of the discussion. In addition, what we're finding is that, presently in the United States, 59% of all US households contain just one or two persons. And in Fairfield, we skew actually a bit higher in that demographic. We have 65% in the town of Fairfield that are either single or two-person households. Only 35% of Fairfield's households are families with children. And the other thing that they did within the market study is they looked at who the potential downtown and metro center renters and buyers would be. I think Jim can add to this slide if he wants to, anecdotally, about some of the things that we've heard about the multifamily developments that have been completed. But what the market study found was that 66% of the expected renters and buyers would be younger singles and couples. So again, it represents those folks without children. 26% would be empty nesters and or retirees, and then 8% would be traditional and non-traditional families. And Jim, I don't know if you want to speak to the developments that have recently been completed, what we're hearing from developers.
Well, just anecdotally, I think what we're hearing, I don't have exact numbers, but I think the feedback we're getting on who is occupying these match up pretty well with these numbers, that it is younger singles, couples, folks that are downsizing, retirees, divorcees, type of thing. So what we're seeing so far, without, statistical numbers, seems to be matching up with what the market study represented.
The other thing that they did within the market study is they talked about how many units Fairfield could build and still have a strong market for those units. And so in downtown, the number of units was 115 through 151 units per year. Metro Center was significantly higher because there's just generally less housing in that part of that train station area. So, they definitely felt like there was market demand over the next 5 years for both stations. The key takeaways for housing was, again, that there was large market potential, that we have to provide a housing alternative for our young singles and couples without children, and that in order to attract younger adults, professionals that are earlier in their career, we need to really downsize the size of units within both our downtown area and in Fairfield Metro for our multifamily developments, because the smaller the unit, the less expensive the rental price. So they found a correlation with that, and something that we just don't have a lot of supply of in Fairfield that could help attract that particular sector of the population. Fairfield also, based on our demographics, we have, we skew a bit older, and we have a relatively large empty nester retiree demand for these units as well. That's what they found in the market study. So the other thing that they did is they put together some visual examples just so that folks could kind of think about what they wanted to see in the Fairfield downtown station area. And so we include this slide that was part of one of their presentations just to kind of, again, have folks think about when you're proposing regulations that then dictate form, what do you want to see? I know that Jim and I have spoken internally about, if we realize that the applicant's proposal is no longer in play, but if we're still talking about some of the consultant's recommendations, which were to limit the overall height to 4 stories, make that first floor higher, so a 15-foot first floor. What does that mean, I think, for people's reactions to what they're seeing out for what's existing and what they'd like to see in Fairfield? We understand that the context of downtown is smaller scale in terms of overall height, number of stories. And so one of the things that we've talked about internally is, is it appropriate to think about that 3 stories, which is a common building type? And if you think back about the kind of the slides that Jim and I provided based on our walking tour, we do have a lot of existing 3-story structures in downtown that share the same building face, as it were. What we don't have yet is a lot of 4-story buildings. So, if people felt more comfortable with that 3-story scenario and they wanted to think about a setback for that 4th floor, those are one of those things that you can discuss through the regulations that you, think about enacting to help you think about that form when it's built in context to infill. One of the last meetings we had was in September before the plan was finalized. Our consultant did talk in detail about the market studies, what the potential for additional multifamily housing and mixed-use projects were in Fairfield, both in downtown and Metro Center. Obviously people, they have a very strong relationship to Fairfield's downtown. So there was more concern, more hesitation about what's the appropriate thing for downtown versus Metro Center, which, is a bit more of a blank slate. So, we hear you, and we certainly think that, the commission was part of those discussions for the board members who were there for those. And I think, the board members heard it as well. Of course, the biggest site that we have available for redevelopment is the Exide redevelopment site. And, it really is too far from the train station to act as a prime TOD office location. But, a mixture of uses on that site would help extend the downtown.
Just want to, before you
Yep.
move on, these next series, throughout this process, you may recall that there were a number of potential scenarios that we were trying to have table discussions about. And again, some very detailed ones with regard to Metro Center, but there were 3 kind of scenarios that we walked through on the downtown that these next 6 slides will kind of capture.
Okay, so the first one was Exide and that redevelopment site. And, one of the things that they just tried to do was just to even give you a starting place for a visual for what infilling that very large site would be. Do you want to break up the block? Do you want to, again, limit to no more than 4 stories? Does that 4 stories have to have a different articulation than the 3 stories below it? So, these are all things that can be discussed in terms of revisions to the regulations. And of course, our consultant did provide some initial recommendations within that adopted plan as well. The other obviously large piece of underutilized land is the downtown station parking lot. Obviously, this would require a public-private partnership in terms of redeveloping this, but it's a very large parking lot where, you know, potentially, you know, there might be, there has the potential to be other things. So that's obviously a longer term, you know, those kinds of public-private partnerships are a bit more complicated than an individual developer having rights for a private piece of property. But, you know, it is something to think about long term, even from a sustainability perspective. That's a very large piece of asphalt that, you know, is a bit of a heat island. Thankfully, when they repaved it just about 2 years ago, they did add some pervious pavement to that, so it's less of a significant runoff issue. But you know, it's from a land use perspective, it's a bit of wasted space. So horizontally, parking spaces can be replaced vertically, as we all know. So they included, again, a concept just to kind of act as a starting place for, you know, what could redevelopment of the station parking lot look like? And again, this wasn't to lock anything into stone in terms of the regulations, but to really just kind of provide a starting place for thinking about what do you want to see there. The other thing that they talked about was the small scale infill development, and I think this is where the heart of the regulations and the board really needs to kind of think about what they want to see. You know, there is definitely potential for you know, some of the one-story structures that may be slightly underutilized. We've certainly seen in the past, since I've been here in the last 4 years, we've had a couple of projects where they've added residential units to the second floor of an existing one-story structure, or, you know, just like the application today where they've converted upper stories to residential. But, you know, there's certainly opportunity where maybe, you know, some of these pre-existing structures might have either reached the end of their lifetime, or, you know, they're ready to kind of be redeveloped. And this is where looking at the, you know, again, the bulk, the density, and the form within the regulations can help us define what the future of downtown Fairfield looks like. Again, they provided a visual example. This is a project that would, of course, not exceed that 4 stories that, you know, they had recommended in their plan. You know, again, whether or not that you know, whether folks feel like, oh, that seems a bit tall, maybe you want to talk about whether a setback for that 4th floor should be something that is discussed. Again, this just provides a visual starting place to talk about what the commission feels is good infill versus what could be better infill, and, you know, the form that you want these buildings to look like in terms of how we can then translate that into proposed regulations. So it is clear that within the updates to the Downtown Central Design Business District that we do need to talk about the current ratio of residential to commercial. You know, there are some strong form requirements that maybe need to be re-examined and kind of re-engaged a bit to, you know, decide, are those still appropriate? Do we need to revise those at all? The other thing that was really discussed too is, you know, should the central business district be expanded westward or eastward in any way, shape, or form? And I don't know that we really talked about this in any of the recent discussions, but whether or not there should be incentives in terms of redeveloping that allows for lower parking ratios for, like, say, the first 1,500 square feet of retail if you are proposing a mixed-use building. So one of the discussions was whether or not, you know, currently within the regulations, we do really focus on retail and consumer-facing businesses on the ground floor. But I think our consultant felt like, well, you know, as long as you make it a space that is convertible to multiple things, and, you know, you give it that 15 feet ceiling height, that nice visibility at the ground floor level, you make it a storefront regardless of whether it's a storefront. It provides that building owner flexibility to lease to an office if that's what the market is. But you end up with that building form that is desirable for Fairfield and is flexible. Of course, the other thing was eliminating minimum unit size. I think we discussed it in one of the previous slides that when you require 750 square feet for a one-bedroom apartment, it really locks in a minimum pricing for that, which is probably higher than some of our target populations who we want to live in our mixed-use buildings. So again, decreasing the size of those units also allows for expanding into that market of folks who don't have the funds to pay, whatever the going rate is for a 750 square foot one bedroom. Keeping in mind too that a lot of these are single person households, whether they're young professionals, whether they're folks that are single on the other end of their spectrum, whether they're divorcees, and a lot of times they might not need that space. So again, the market study circled back to the types of units that folks might be looking for, and they tended to say that they were a bit smaller. In terms of floor area ratio, our current limit allows 90% lot coverage and an FAR limit of 2. Part of our walking tour was to kind of figure out, well, what do we have now, and what do we want to see? I think for our consultants' recommendation, they said, well, there is a standard of at least 2.5 FAR within a lot of downtown areas. If you want to incentivize additional, if you want to maximize the development potential, you might want to even think about an FAR of 3. So this just provides a visual example of what that means in terms of, the same lot coverage, and obviously that increases the number of stories on that lot. For height limits, we've talked about this a bit in terms of what the current regulations allow, which is 5 stories or 50 feet, whichever is less. And we have talked about if you're going to have that flexible higher height first story level, that decreasing to 4 stories but increasing your overall height would help accommodate maybe some of that building form that you would like to see, as opposed to just assuming that there's a 10-foot floor plate for each developable floor. Again, they are recommending abolishing that minimum unit size. They are talking about increasing the FAR, and so they gave kind of 3 alternatives. So increase kind of your beginning step would be increased to an FAR of 2.5. They really recommend going to 3 based upon that 4 stories, 52 feet in height. And then basically to maximize the footprint, you would have to go to a 3.6 in order to really fill all 4 stories. But, again, from a form perspective, that may be something that the board wants to talk about if they're not comfortable with a full 4 stories all on the same plane. So one of the other things that they felt was that there are areas of downtown that are really pedestrian friendly, and then there are some areas where you do have these setback buildings. I know that one of the pictures that Jim and I took was of the taller office building that you can see from Sherman Street. And part of the reason you can see it so well is because the Rite Aid is significantly set back. Oftentimes in walkable pedestrian centers, you don't have minimum setback requirements, you have maximum setback requirements, so that you do have this continuous pedestrian environment where you have, again, it's hard when you design a downtown area for cars versus people, because the pedestrian walking experience becomes challenging. You have to walk further distances from storefront to storefront. So, thinking about form and how we improve some of the infill opportunities, that was one of the recommendations from the consultant, and also being more flexible as to how you provide parking, including shared parking. So, for example, expanding the radius to 1,000 feet for joint parking scenarios, removing the requirement that those parcels have to be directly adjacent, also encouraging car sharing services to locate downtown, whether you provide specialized parking spaces within commercial lots. One of the discussions in planning circles right now is about the scarcity of curb frontage, both in terms of package deliveries and these car services like Uber, Lyft, et cetera. Everybody's battling for a place on the curb. let alone people who want to park there. So, that might be something to consider, and removing that from the curb, but putting it in a place that's convenient for businesses and for mixed use environments. Jim, did you want to still go through all of this?
So yeah, thanks, Emmeline, for the excellent job. So
and just tell me when to forward.
Okay, so just with that, what we were going to do is with that backdrop of that whole planning effort, we were going to then compare. I was going to then compare the plan, what manifested itself in a recommendation of the plan on the left, to the applicant's proposal. Although there is no applicant proposal pending, but I think it's still fruitful to talk about the proposed recommendations and how you might feel about those going forward. So, as was prefaced, our regulation currently limits residential use in downtown to no more than 2 stories and no more than 50% of the floor area of the building. And for all the reasons that were just articulated in the study, the plan recommended consideration of eliminating that 50% cap and the 2-story cap and allow still the ground story, just to provide more flexibility in terms of uses if there is going to be reinvestment. There was also discussion about reducing that maximum, or I'm sorry, the minimum size from 750 to 450 at the time. That matched up with what we required for the accessory apartment regulation, as we discussed last time. That's been eliminated, and I will say that in the bill that's recently passed the House, there is a provision in that bill that would prohibit a regulation from having a minimum unit size that exceeds whatever the building code requires. So we may be moving towards a, should the Senate pass a bill and it move on, we may be moving towards a scenario where we're prohibited from establishing a minimum unit size. But for now, snapshot view, the plan goal was to reduce that from 750 to 450. So I don't know, Mr. Chairman, if you want me to recap the regulation proposals, then you can go back and talk about them, or talk about them each as we're presenting them. Up to you.
I think we do an overview of all of them first, and then we can sort of come back to it. I think that makes the most sense, unless somebody else.
That's fine. So we can go to the next slide then. And as was talked about, the current 5-story max, 50 feet, the recommendation was reduce that story cap to 4 stories. So from 5 stories to 4, and increase the height from 50 feet to 52 feet. But maintain a requirement that that lower floor the ground floor be 15 feet in height. So basically a story height reduction. I don't think you, and then to companion with that is to increase potential reinvestment opportunity, was to gives consideration to expanding the floor area ratio, which is presently capped at 2, an FAR of 2 or 200% of the lot size. Again, an FAR is simply the total floor area of a building as compared to its lot size. So right now we have an FAR of 2 or 200% of the area of the lot, and the plan recommended considering 3. Now again, I talked about a range, 2.5 upwards, 2.5 minimum consideration, but the applicant in the plan, the former applicant, was talking about an FAR of 3. Next is with respect to was parking. Was talking about, in our present TOD park regulation in Commerce Drive, we have residential requirement for 1 space per bedroom or 1 1/4 spaces per unit. The lesser of that in this plan recommended considering that for downtown, that maybe there's areas where for residential area we could implement that same type of parking. I will also say parenthetically that in the bill that just was recently passed by the House, but not yet by the Senate, talks about capping residential parking requirements to no more than 1 space for a 1-bedroom unit and no more than 2 parking spaces for a unit that has 2 or more bedrooms. In my view, I think that would really have limited applicability Here, because in our TOD regs, we already require less parking than what they're requiring. The question here was whether there should be some applicability to this lesser residential standard for parking downtown. The next slide was unique to the applicant's proposal, so I don't know that we need to go there. I think the next slide is with respect to setbacks. That's right. So there were some setback application or proposals in the applicant's proposal, but the plan did not make any specific recommendations with regard to setback. But as Emmeline discussed, it might be beneficial to talk about that as to whether you want. Right now, we have a minimum 10-foot street line setback. Should we consider a maximum setback in lieu of a minimum? Right now, we allow 0 setback on one side, but not on the other. Does it make sense in some downtown context to allow 0 on both sides? So that's something we might want to consider. And then whether or not our present regulations would require additional setback above the height of 30 feet. But if we're talking about a larger story height on the ground floor, I think you'd reach 30 feet before you got to the 3rd floor. So maybe a consideration of increasing the point at which additional setback is required. So maybe you can have 3 floors on the same plane, but if you're going to go to a 4th story, then maybe it should be set back some minimum distance to break up the massing of a building, if that's something you think is important to consider. So that was a quick run through of the regulation proposals for downtown. We can go back 2 slides, I think, to kind of go back to where. So the focus really on residential is how much of a percentage of the building, right? Should we allow more than 50% of the area of the building in more than 2 stories and a lesser unit size? That's really the residential piece to this. So I don't know. I'll leave it there, and if you want to kind of have some discussion on where folks might fall on that.
Yeah, good. So why don't we? It'd probably be helpful for discussion purposes, go back to the videos screen. Stop screen sharing. The moment so that I can see people. There we go. So how do we feel about the first proposal here? Open it up for a little discussion. Anyone have any comments?
Is that reducing the 750 square feet?
So this is eliminating the 50% requirement.
The one?
There's 3 pieces to this. Eliminating the 50% cap on total occupancy of residential use, in eliminating the 2-story cap, and a minimum unit size. Those are the three pieces to this.
Commissioner Corcoran, then Commissioner Brinkman.
Do we have a 2-story cap? I thought we were at 50 feet and 4 stories.
You are correct that the overall height permitted in the design district
because of the FAR
is 5 stories, 50 feet, but you're capped at no more than 2 floors of residential occupancy.
Right. Well, I think that that we should increase the residential part of it. I mean, we're looking at denser housing in the TOD areas. I don't want to go. I wouldn't want to go to 100% residential, but 50% is just a number. I think we can increase that, and it's part of what our overall goal is.
And to increase the diversity of housing stock, and that would certainly accomplish that.
And to increase the density in the center of town.
Still requiring commercial on the ground floor.
Yes.
And 15-foot ceiling heights, floor height for the ground floor at least.
I like that idea.
Okay. Commissioner Brinkman.
I agree with Commissioner Corcoran. I think we're already seeing the market speaking. We just had a compliance application where The applicant sought a variance to have more than 50% residential on the upper floors. I think there's certainly demand for it. As long as the commercial is required on the ground floor, you're going to preserve the character of downtown, what people like about downtown, which is that you can walk between different commercial uses. So I would be in favor of eliminating the 50% cap on residential and eliminating the requirement that no more than 2 floors be residential. In terms of, the minimum apartment size, I think, events may overtake us, as Mr. Wentz says, in terms of not being able to regulate a minimum size, but I don't feel strongly about, a minimum size of 450 versus no minimum size versus something slightly larger than 450.
Okay. Commissioner Levy?
Yeah, I'm not sure that we need to have a maximum residential, as long as we have the first floor commercial with the 15 feet. Hypothetically, if it's a 4-story building, you're not going to exceed 75%. So I think we can just eliminate the residential aspect as long as we limit or require that commercial and the 15-foot be on the first floor. As far as minimum size, again, Hartford may address that. As one who lived in a tiny, tiny apartment in Soho for $290 a month with 3 people in 1977, even 450 is good size. I think there are 3 of us in about that size. A studio apartment, 300, 350 feet is fine. And if, that works for some single individuals, I think that would be fine. So I would eliminate, rather than even a 450 minimum, again, I would just, I think the building code would address that in terms of access to windows and so forth, but I don't think that's somewhere we have to go in terms of the zoning.
Well, it would, but, we're not Soho, and I'm not so sure that that's what we aspire to be. I mean, I think that would be my initial reaction to that.
It's a different generation and era.
Mm-hmm. Other comments, Commissioner Francis?
Yes, I like the idea of the 15-foot first floor. I pretty much like the 750 square feet. I guess I could live with 6 or 650, but I would like Fairfield to have certain standards, assuming the state will allow it. And
A minimum of 750.
yeah. And, maybe the point that they're a little expensive for a single person with his first job, but that's the brand new ones that will cost that. I mean, you can just get one that's 10, 20 years old and it won't cost as much.
Well, I think the point is there are none that are 10 or 20 years old because they're not.
Over Brick Walk, there are some that are older. And in Sanford Street, where we're proposing that, there are a couple of little houses. There's lots of little things that we don't really know about until you really look. But you're right, not a lot. And the residential component, yeah, I could see 2/3 or something. That's a good idea because it seems to be more of the demand now is housing and not office space.
Mm-hmm. Commissioner Braun?
But I do like setbacks.
Yeah, we'll talk about setbacks and FAR and, separately. We're trying to limit this in some organized way to talk about them individually. Commissioner Braun?
So the residential units are 10 feet, right? The residential floors.
Or what? Say that again now.
And I'm sorry, I've got 2 things going at the same time. I hope you can hear me. I'm getting feedback, but the residential floors, are they 10 feet high?
Well, there's that would be a minimum under the building code. I think is 10 feet.
You can. I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman, if you may. You can go less than that, but what we're seeing in the marketplace now is, you know, a 10-foot floor plate is what most folks are building. And I don't know that we're dictating a floor height, but we're just presuming in the proposal that the 52 feet would be 15 foot, and then like I think 12 feet between floor, you know, a 10-foot floor plate, and then there's space between, you know, structurally that takes up that space. So we're not dictating it. We're just saying that that's generally what we're seeing in new construction is 10-foot floor plates, you know, floor to ceiling.
Floor to ceiling, but then you have to build in about 2 feet on either side. So, you know, you're looking at 15 plus 14 plus 14 plus 12. That'd be 55. So if you talk about a 4-story structure that has a 15-foot ceiling height on the ground floor for commercial, and then 3 floors of residential above that, each of those floors having a 10-foot ceiling height, with the space in between the floors, you're looking at an overall building height of approximately 55 feet. Does that sound about right?
Yeah, if it's a 15-foot ground floor and then 3 12-foot building height, you know, plates to achieve a 10-foot, you're looking at 51 feet. You know, what the plan called for is 52 feet. You know, the application we just saw that's no longer pending proposed a couple of feet higher than that, but the plan recommends 52 feet.
Yeah.
So there's no difference in terms of height than what we allow now, except that the FAR doesn't allow this, right?
Yeah, so that's correct. There are other self-limiting features of our regulations that prevent a developer from building a building that caps out at the 50 feet.
And I would worry about the canyon effect, you know, the light and all that. Also, I would always want to have some green space. That gets to the setback issue though. But the vertical setback on the ground floor, third and fourth floor, I would like to see the horizontal setback on those floors to make it
Right.
less of a canyon effect if we were going to do this.
So what we see is that you know, proposals, right, where the building maxes out on the height and everything, and then they want to put a green space and a barbecue area and so forth on the top of the building, right, as opposed to creating some mid-level setback, which could then be used for that amenity space or green space and so forth, and not adding to the overall height, which would also contain that that area. Be
It's a
interesting
good idea.
what that would look like. I don't know if that would be palatable.
I meant green space on the ground, actually.
Yeah, no, that's sorry. I was kind of just running with what some
Okay.
of you were saying. Green space on the ground, we've got, you know, most of the downtown area has no green space whatsoever. I mean, think about that. On the road in downtown, just building after building after building. No side setbacks. The buildings are directly next to each other. There's sidewalk area.
And another consideration would be what percentage of affordable housing would we require? If these are tiny units, would they be sort of de facto, but we wouldn't get credit for them? How would what's the optimal way that could work so we can get credit for this? Because 8-30G is not going anywhere from what I understand.
Yeah, that's
the plan doesn't make a recommendation. We already, under our inclusionary zoning requirements, any proposal that has 10 or more units would require 10% of the units to be deed restricted at 80% area median income, and those units would get credited, you know, as housing equivalency unit points towards the 8-30G. So we're proposing to maintain that requirement that, but if you've got a development of less than 10 units presently, you would not be required to have any deed restricted units.
And then my last concern is, it would be interesting to see sort of a schematic. I'm just remembering what Attorney Burke was saying. If you have big building next to big building next to big building, what does that do if we make this more or less as of right, or if we uniformize these more flexible, if we liberalize the requirements, what happens if it gets totally built out that way? What does the downtown look like? That's it.
Commissioner Brayman, then Commissioner Corcoran.
It's slightly off topic, but while Commissioner Braun raised the important issue of affordability, I would be in favor of increasing the percentage, the required percentage of affordability to 12%, consistent with what we did in Metro when we approved the text change.
Commissioner Corcoran.
About the FAR, I noticed that currently we're at 90%. Is there, Jim, do you know what the reasoning is for being at 90%?
I don't know. That's been that way for more than 30 years. I think some of it may be reflective of the existing conditions that when the regulations were established, that a lot of our downtown buildings, the core, the post road, a lot of it was built prior to the regulations existing. So some of that was, I'm speculating, but I'm speculating that some of it was reflective of what was on the ground at the time regulations were first developed.
So does this mean that a building cannot fill the lot?
Well, it's hard to maximize every single one of these requirements. You've got a 90% lot coverage footprint and a maximum FAR total square footage, but you also have a requirement to provide on-site parking for the square footage of the occupancy that you are proposing. Or, we do have a provision that certain adjacent properties or properties within 500 feet be able to be used to establish parking. So it may not necessarily be on the entirety of the footprint. For example, that 140 Sherman Street building has additional parking on Sherman Street on a lot that's diagonally across the street that's rarely used, but there under the proposal. So between the requisite parking and FAR and lot coverage, it's hard to maximize every single one of those things. What we're looking at here is trying to consider a menu of options to give a prospective developer a little bit more flexibility in what they can propose. But if the more stories you add, you go to full 4 stories, it's hard. Yes, you can't achieve, hard to achieve a 4-story building with an FAR of 2, but at the same time, the more stories and the more coverage you provide, the more likely it is that you're going to need to have some manner of structured parking, which contributes to your FAR, or to seek some sort of off-site nearby parking jointly with others.
Well, what I'm concerned about is what happens to this 10% if it's not used for parking? I mean, say you have underground parking. And as Matt brought up a minute ago, we don't have any green space in town. And just what is that 10% for? I mean, does it become an alley between buildings, or is it?
Well, at present, again, under new construction, you can only have a 0 setback on one side. So, if you look at the buildings from the aerial view, and I don't know if we have those images, that the aerial images of what presently exists, but when you look at a building from the front that looks like it may be a 0 setback on the street and 0 on each side, but when you get to an aerial view, there's areas in the back that may have some areas for
Okay, yeah, that makes sense.
refuge and in alleys and in service.
I don't know if that 10% is the right number or not. I just have no idea. I mean,
10%. What do you mean?
well, it's what's left over from the 90.
Oh, yeah. I mean, again, that's an existing requirement that we're not proposing to modify as part of this recommendation. You certainly can consider it. What we're talking about is, should we bump the FAR up above 2, given the fact that we allow a relatively generous lot coverage. Most of the buildings downtown have a less than 90% lot coverage, because if you have surface parking, that's taking away from your building
Right.
footprint. Those that have a greater than 90% or 100% coverage even are likely, buildings that were built that have 0 on-site parking, like, the community theater building, for example, occupies, not 100%, but probably 90, but has no, on-site parking. It was built, in the 20s before any of that was even considered.
Okay. Shall we move along to the next subject?
Yeah, the next piece, so we talked about percentage of residential occupancy in floors of occupancy. The next piece is, the height, reducing the height from 5 stories to 4. And I think a lot of that, it sounded like a lot of people were kind of combining those two, as long as there was still a requirement for commercial presence, that 4 stories and 52 feet seem to be okay. Then the next piece of that is the floor area ratio of presently at 2. The plan called for 3. In the context of that, is 3 the right number? Is 2.5 would be the minimum recommendation or the average of downtowns elsewhere? The question is, do you want to provide a greater opportunity at an FAR of 3? So I think the FAR piece would probably be the next logical step, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, very good. Commissioner Levy?
Yeah. I would go with the FAR of 3, but I think it's also interrelated to some degree with the setback. And I'll just talk about let's say that 4th floor. That I think, if we were to maintain something like a 10-foot setback for that 4th floor, similar to the loft apartments on Ruane Street, it has a way of breaking up that mass. So they are basically interrelated. So I would approach it that way, with allowing the FAR of 3, but then when we get the setbacks, at least I'm talking again on the 4th floor, that we would have a setback there to deal with the massiveness of the building.
And that setback, I think, would most notably be on the front property line, right?
Correct. Yes, that's what I'd envision.
Right. So it's a setback.
So you're talking about a street line, an additional street line setback of 10 feet above the 3rd floor level, in addition to whatever the
Right.
first 3 floors may be setback.
Right.
Correct.
Commissioner Corcoran.
But we're not really talking about a setback, though. We're talking about an FAR. So in theory, someone.
But yeah, Commissioner Levy is suggesting is that the FAR of 3 would be contingent upon additional setback requirements above the 3rd floor on the street line of 10 feet.
Yeah, I think it's fair to kind of consider those in jointly, as if you're not comfortable with additional FAR without the combination of additional setback, I think it makes sense to consider those in combination.
Okay. Yeah, Commissioner Francis.
Emmeline, were there any pictures of three-story building? I was reviewing the pictures that you did last time, and everything I liked was 1.8 or 2 FAR. Were there any pictures of that had the setbacks a little with over 3?
I think Jim can speak to that, but I think what we were finding is that because there was so much surface parking for a lot of these developments, that you really didn't get to that level of FAR because they weren't utilizing what was taking up the site was a lot of surface parking. So they weren't getting to that level of FAR. But I think when you're talking about infill development now, you're going to have, the idea is going to be that generally the building's going to be over some of the parking.
Please.
You might be on smaller sites. So, your FAR, because your upper levels are covering more of the site and you might have some of that parking below, you're not going to end up with these larger surface parking lots anymore. So your FAR might go up.
See, one of the buildings that I liked best was Lofts and Chico's. That might be Fairfield U Bookstore, might that all be one building. I thought that was attractive. I'm not sure I'm into 4 stories in town, or in most of it. Since I'm used to looking at 1s and 2s, and that I would call a 3, even though I'm not sure it is, but it has the height to be a 3. And I think that's about where my tastes go for the center.
So by I'll come back to you in a second. So by increasing the overall height, the number of floors, the additional residential units, reduction in the square footage, minimum size of a unit will require that will all result in increased parking requirements that will need to be met on the site. And that's going to result in more buildings of the type that we saw proposed at Umpqua, as well as what's being built or been proposed and being built in these 830Gs, which is, a building on stilts with underground, with parking on that first floor, right? Now I guess we're requiring commercial on the first floor, but how do we avoid how does a developer comply with parking requirements given the additional development that these amendments that we're considering would permit?
That's a good question. I think some of it does lead, if you're going to attempt to maximize at every dimension, 4 stories, full FAR, full lot coverage, you would need some manner of structured parking. There's another piece of that that's not codified in the plan document itself, but in the planning work, there was one of the slides, there was suggestion that if there is structured parking, that there be a minimum depth of fronting commercial space on the ground floor. So
Yeah.
it wraps the parking structure so you don't have exposed parking at the street level. That if there is a parking structure, that at least for a certain depth from the street, that there'd be a commercial occupancy so that it doesn't look like a parking structure. We have an enclosure requirement, but I think I'd have to go back to the slides. It was toward the back, but again, there's some discussion. There was some discussion in that planning work of, having a consideration of a minimum depth of commercial occupancy.
Yeah.
On street level parking.
So does a parking garage constitute commercial street first floor commercial activity?
No, we would require the structured parking contributes to the FAR calculation, but we don't consider that commercial occupancy. So what we would, the other thing to consider is in an amendment is if you do have grade level structured parking, that it has, aside from the driveway entrance or exit that you might need, that there'd be street facing commercial space to a minimum depth, so that and that's kind of what you saw, on the Uncle Road project. As there was
Yep.
from the Uncle Road perspective, there were storefronts, and then behind that was parking.
No, not on Sanford Street.
Correct.
Sanford Street became the Umpqua project development's back alley.
Correct.
Yeah, I think I see you, Commissioner Levy and Brayman. I think Commissioner Corcoran had his hand up before you.
No, I'll pass.
Okay, Commissioner Levy.
Yeah, I think having a minimum depth on the commercial is important, certainly at least on one side, because otherwise you could have a 10-foot deep commercial with parking for the rest of the building on the first floor behind.
Mm-hmm.
It does present the issue of how do you deal with a building which is, all the way through, like the one we were looking at, which goes from Umpqua all the way to Sanford. Do you treat Sanford as well, like a street line, and require commercial there or not? I don't know.
I think you do, and that was one of my problems. That was one of my observations. As I just characterized it, the Sanford Street became 15 Umpqua LLC's back alley, right? That's where the trash cans were. That's where the garage doors were, and so forth. And I think that if it is street, frontage, I think it has to be treated that way. I mean, so it kind of, I think this is a bit of a sticky wicket, because we are seeking to enable a much more dense style of development with many more residential units and reducing substantially or eliminating a minimum size on the residential units is going to result of, substantially more a number of units, which are each going to require, parking.
Yeah, I think.
Yeah, sorry, Commissioner Brayman was next.
I shared a lot of the observations and concerns about the special permit application for 15 Umpqua. One of them was, frankly, height. And I'm just talking about concerns that were expressed by members of the public. I think personally, in terms of height, the TOD study recommendation of 4 stories and 52 feet maximum, with a 15-foot minimum ground floor, is appropriate. In terms of FAR, I could be had for anything 2.5 or anything between 2.5 and 3. I think that we act prudently when we move incrementally toward greater density and more intense uses. I think that the public appreciates that and expects a certain degree of that. I think, for instance, when we were expanding our accessory apartment regulations, there were certain things that we could have done, more dramatically, that we decided to do incrementally instead. So I think there's a lot to be said for moving cautiously, but also responding to what the demand is, for greater residential density in downtown. A lower FAR than the then applicant was asking for an FAR of 3.0. Something less than 3.0 would make for a more modest structure in that space, if you're using 15 Uncle Road as an example. The applicant was asking for, no setbacks after the third floor. I think Commissioner Levy's, point about having a setback, a 10-foot setback required after the third floor makes sense. And when we'll get to parking, the applicant was asking for, reduction of parking to 1.25 per household. I think we may want to keep it at 1.5 for now. I think that there is quite a demand for, there's quite a need for parking in downtown, especially in the center, the very center of downtown.
Okay, thanks. Anyone else? Commissioner Francis?
Yeah, the parking downtown is we have so many restaurants and they're so busy. Come 5 o'clock every night, there's hardly any parking. And I don't think it's as bad at lunchtime. It's probably more local business people using it, but boy, it's bad at night. And it's not our responsibility to provide all this housing either. I mean, as buildings age and developers want to demolish them, maybe they'll apply for 100% residential and maybe we'll approve it. Because some of these buildings are getting old. And in fact, the one they were talking about, 15 Umpqua, is old, and so is the next one up. So these things may happen of their own accord in due time. Not tomorrow, but soon.
Commissioner Braun.
So I get concerned if we maximize everything, we kind of lose control over directing character of the downtown. So the community theater could be dwarfed with a 51-foot tall building. Other parts of the downtown could as well. So that's my concern. We maximize everything. And also, Emmeline, thank you. You sent me the link, but I can't use it while I'm doing the Zoom, I guess. But can you show us the link again, the slide that had and explained better the FAR with the 90% coverage and then the height that's allowed? I'm a little confused about that. And is it possible to get, well, like you said, in real life, it doesn't really exist because of the surface parking that surrounds most of the buildings. But the schematic.
Are you talking about from the slideshow from this evening, or from?
Like 5 or 6 different options with different FARs.
Okay.
Different height, and could you just delve into that a little bit so I understand it a little better? So they all had 90% coverage.
I can talk about that a little bit. The previous slide, this slide presumes a maximum lot coverage of 90% in showing what various floor area ratios would be at certain stories. So if you max out at night, assuming maxing out at 90% coverage, a 3-story building would be an FAR of 2.7, and a 4-story building would be an FAR of 3.6. Now, within that space, or within what our regulations provide for distance offsite, have to still provide parking. So that's why it's hard to maximize both the lot coverage and the FAR. In order to get a higher FAR with a lesser coverage, you need to go higher. So again, we're talking about reducing the maximum story height from 5 to 4. The examples that we showed in the previous slide deck in our last planning discussion didn't have a lot of examples of FARs of greater than 2. Number one, because the regulations don't permit it now, but the only one that we had was a 5-story building, and wouldn't be able to achieve that at a 4-story building. So this was just kind of an example from the consultant's slide deck, is just kind of showing that if you assume a 90% coverage, this is what you would get. So if somebody's maxing out at lot coverage and an FAR, you're not going to be able to get a 4-story building in an FAR of 3 at a 90% lot coverage. It's just, you just can't do it. In order to get 4 stories at an FAR of 3, you're going to have a less than 90% lot coverage.
So even if the parking requirements are eliminated by the legislation that's going through, presumably we could still have some control over our development by using things we've already got in our zoning regulations, like FAR.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're not, and again, I don't want to, the legislation isn't proposing to eliminate parking. It's what the legislation has pending is no more than 1 space per 1-bedroom unit and 2 spaces for a 2-bedroom unit. So if you were to utilize that as a base, a mix of a development that is a mix of 1 and 2-bedroom units would average some, depending on the mix, assuming they're equal, would be 1.5 spaces per unit, which I think Commissioner Brayman was suggesting might be a reasonable number. But our TOD, we don't have a TOD overlay downtown, but for Metro Center, we already are requiring less than 2 spaces per unit. It's the lesser of 1 space per bedroom or 1.25 spaces per unit. Again, on the presumption that it's mixed use, there's going to be some commercial, and the peak times are not necessarily going to coincide. I just want to go back to 2 things. I mean, I personally, at night, and there's a lot of restaurant activity downtown and a lot of people there. I think it's a good thing, to have a bit of congestion in your downtown, because it's a very good sign that things are healthy. But I just wanted to go back to that one slide, not to go to the slide, but just to reference the slide where we're talking about a minimum depth of commercial space to screen parking structures. In that slide recommended a 20-foot minimum occupancy depth. So that's just, I just wanted to recap that. But again, yes, you have authority on the FAR. Right now it's 2. Should it be more than that? We're talking about reducing the floor height from 5 to 4. And again, you're not going to be able to maximize all of those things at the same time. Something, it's, there's pushes and pulls in each of those elements. And more often than not, it's the minimum parking that drives the total square footage that you can have or occupancy on but that's just what we've been seeing historically. Okay.
I was just going to say, if we maximized all these options for maximum flexibility, then we do lose some control because everything is maximized. You can build out to the maximum all these criteria.
You can't. That's the point that's being made. But if you wanted to, have a higher ceiling height, you could have less stories, but then you'd need less parking, so you could have more, of FAR. It just pushes and pulls, as it were. But you wouldn't be able to maximize every variable. Yeah, Commissioner.
It seems that what we're proposing will pack a lot of cars into underneath or underground in these buildings. I'm wondering if we should be investigating municipal parking if we're going to increase the density that much.
Having worked in a place where they do that a lot in California, it's very expensive. So I don't know if that's something that the town wants to take on, but it's extremely costly.
Yeah. Commissioner
For whom? The town or the people who use the parking?
Both. So, normally when they build these parking structures, they do charge a fee to park. It's structured. I mean, essentially, when you think about the train parking station right now, you can walk quite a significant distance in order to have to go catch the train because
You can run quite a
it's
distance.
it's a very linear parking lot, right? So, in a lot of places where they do this out west, they've bonded for this construction. Then they charge a certain amount for the parking when you park within the structure. It's by hour, and it tends to be embedded within, a commercial district. But it's not inexpensive. It's very costly. I think for structured parking, what is it, $50,000 a space? So it's very expensive.
Yeah, just to, if I can, it is kind of funny to see how willing we are to park what would be the equivalent of 3 or 4 or more blocks away, on a large parking lot, at a train station, for example, or back in pre-COVID when retail was humming at a mall at Christmas time. But in a downtown scenario, if you're walking the very same distance, it feels like you're parking too far away from your intended target. But some of you may know, some of you may not, when the former Fairfield store property was redeveloped into what now is, Fairfield University Bookstore, that development, the town entered into an agreement with the developer to kind of incentivize them to provide more parking spaces than we otherwise would have required them to have by giving them the town actually leased a number of spaces from the developer as an incentive as for a downtown supply of parking. So that development acts as a lot of properties do in street parking as a reservoir, if you will, that in our downtown, because of its compactness, if you park at Sherman Green, it's not an unreasonable walk to get to a restaurant or store, or if you park in that lower level behind the Fairfield University Bookstore and shop there, and if you're going to go across the street to another store, you're generally not moving your car. So there's a supply of parking, and the town has been working with the parking authority too, mainly on the south side of the tracks, that after 5 o'clock, that's another reservoir of parking that's generally available. The north side, the entirety of the commuter lot after, I believe, 5 o'clock, you can park in without getting ticketed.
Right.
Yeah, you got to come up and over the stairs to get there. It would be nice if we had a better up and over convenient pass through. But there is a fairly large supply of parking that's within, if it were one large development, if you looked at downtown as one big large development and how far you would typically park away from your intended destination at such a development, you're really not, it's really not a whole lot different from downtown. It just kind of behaviorally seems different.
That's fair. And there's a whole second story, that parking structure behind the Fairfield bookstore that remains virtually empty all the time. And that's Commissioner Levy.
Yeah, I had a question for Mr. Wendt. Looking at the parking requirements, if there is commercial on the first floor and then residential on other floors, are the parking requirements sort of cumulative for the two, or how do they interrelate, or is there any offset considering the different needs or times between the commercial and the residential?
It's a combination of all of those things. Right now, our regulations say when you have multiple uses in the building, you aggregate all of those requirements and provide that number of spaces. There is a provision in the commercial parking regulation that gives the commission flexibility to reduce the residential component parking of a mixed-use project by up to 50% at your discretion if you think that the way that it's developed, the peak times for the commercial are not going to coincide with the residential. There's some question about that with some case law as to whether exercising discretion within a regulation is legal. But we've had a lot of discussion about potentially changing or looking at our parking regulations, and do we require too much? Is it, I personally believe that once a facility or a site has a certain number of spaces, you don't need to keep adding those incremental spaces. You get certain economies of scale that ensue. But the present regulation, to answer your question directly, is a combination of all of those things. You do have discretion to reduce the residential component parking, but I think we require a higher level of residential parking than we might necessarily need to. If we reduced, right now, for example, you need 2 or 3 spaces per unit, which in a downtown context, I think is probably too much. If you reduced the number of spaces per unit, then perhaps we wouldn't need the percentage reduction language, but we can play with that. But as it stands now, it's a combination of all those factors.
Thank you.
Commissioner Elliott.
So, Mr. Went, do we have a kind of a tally of the amount of parking in that district, in that area? The public parking, street parking between, I mean, is there kind of something to go off of?
That's an excellent question. There was at one point we know how many spaces the town controls and maintains, but I don't know that we have an analysis of all the private parking lots that at certain times act as repositories for public parking. For example, plenty of people park at Rite Aid and go to the restaurants in the adjacent property after a certain time. I don't think that that business is active in trying to chase people out of there or prevent people from doing that. Smaller lots, maybe not so much. But I can look into that. I don't know the answer if we have a current inventory, but that's something I think that would be important to have an understanding of order of magnitude of what the parking supply is. I can tell you there's over 1,500 spaces on the north side, in the commuter parking lot that are available after 5 o'clock. Between 9 and 5, what's the parking situation? It's been the subject of debate for as long as, for over 30 years. Is there enough? Is there not enough? But to answer your question, is there a number of spaces? Do we know that number? I don't know the answer to that, but it's an excellent question that we'll take a look at.
And let's not forget, it's available all on weekends.
All right, I think we need to, or we should move on to the next.
Okay, so the last, again, we talked about setbacks a little bit in the context of the FAR, because there was some feeling that, and I agree that it's kind of jointly related. Parking, there was some suggestion that, I've lost my page. Flipping through to find my depth of retail occupancy, and here it is. I'm sorry. So the last recommendation in the plan was to give consideration to the same level of TUD parking. And should it be, 1 space per bedroom or 1.25 spaces per unit, as we do in TOD? I don't know that we need to go that far yet. As if talking about incrementally, maybe we take a look at what the result would be if we adopted a similar provision to what the state is suggesting in terms of residential, that 1 for a 1-bedroom unit and 2 per a 2-bedroom unit. And but that's just my thought. But that's I'll leave that there. And the only other thing on the table, so to speak, would be if we want to talk about setbacks other than additional setback above a certain height. I think my reading of what I'm hearing is there's support to maintain or require some level of setback above, if you're going to be above the 3rd floor, and if we're going to consider an additional FAR, there seems to be a sentiment that there needs to be built in at least 10-foot additional setback for a fourth floor. The question about the street line setback, regardless of height, should it be a 10-foot minimum? Should there be a maximum? Is 0 okay?
Yeah. No, so we should talk about that. And I saw Commissioner Levy, then Francis.
Yeah. When I think of our downtown and setbacks along the street line, I sort of think of that area basically from the going to the railroad bridge where the yoga studio was, to basically the pantry, as buildings which are pretty much all on the street line. And I think, I mean, the one thing I don't want to see in any of the downtown area is parking in front of the buildings. So to my mind, you know, for that, and it might just be that for that overlay, for that area there, we would have, you know, basically buildings on the street line. And then other areas, we might have a minimum setback with a requirement that it would only be used for either public dining, public, you know, parks, some sort of public use as opposed, but anything but parking in front of the buildings. I don't want to see something like the development at the foot of Sasko Hill Road there with the parking lot in front and the building in the back. You know, so to my mind, I think we would have, we'd actually encourage, you know, in terms of walkability, the pedestrian, you know, use of it, a 0 setback for that downtown area in the center, and then a maximum setback limited to a public use.
Mhm.
Yeah. I think Commissioner Francis was next, and then Commissioner Brayman.
You know,
All set?
there, yeah, I would agree with that. I like the sidewalks, the wide sidewalks, where Commissioner Levy was discussing is across the street. I like even better, but until those buildings age out, you can't really do anything. You know, the ones on the north side, but the south side is much more desirable. And I would like a building setback. If we're even have 25, 6, 7 feet off the ground, I'd like the setback for the 3rd floor, never mind the 4th floor, which I'm not sure I even like. But I agree with him about the public use too. It's more gracious when you have plazas or wide sidewalks and definitely no parking. You're right.
Commissioner Brayman.
I agree with Commissioners Levy and Francis. I think, you know, a 0 setback against the sidewalk could be nice in creating a sense of streetscape, and it's certainly you don't want parking in the front of the property, and a maximum setback can do that. And you can require that there be some sort of public use within. If there is going to be a setback, that there be some, you know, benches or public use there, or outdoor dining. And I think the only thing that we have to think about is under what circumstances would we want to allow a 0 setback on the side, so that you could have attached properties, you know, by mutual agreement of the, you know, the 2 property owners. You have certain properties that are already attached, I guess, historically in the center of downtown, with the 0 setback on the sides, and I don't know the extent to which we want to allow that or you know, forbid that.
Yeah, there are some rather considerable stretches, right, of area that are not the post road between the pantry and Umpqua, right? I mean, this is going to, well, and it doesn't have to. I mean, at some point we should talk about a specific overlay area where perhaps we want to, or the specific area in which we would like to see these regulations adopted. But yes, I think to all of your points, and as these buildings, you know, and the properties, you know, get redeveloped and turn over, you know, that's what we'd like to see. Other comments on these points, Mr. Braun?
I would like to see, I agree with Meg, Commissioner Francis. I would like to see wider sidewalks, requirement for landscaping or cherry trees or something like that. More opportunity, the flexibility that we could require, more opportunity for public space, but I agree, not for parking. Other than I worry secondarily, maybe not for tonight, about the infrastructure under the ground. It's pretty old. Do we need to ask engineering about this increase in density and how much capacity we have, whether it's sewer, water, pipes, underground drainage, or how far can we go with saying to the density burden on our infrastructure? That's something we can get input.
Yeah, that's a twofold issue. One is sanitary sewer capacity, in which the Water Pollution Control Authority has to approve the flows for any prospective development to determine whether or not they can be accommodated in the system or whether there are mitigating infrastructure improvements that one might need to make to accommodate that. So anytime there's a development or a redevelopment, in a lot of cases, it comes with either a plan to upgrade certain capacities or a payment in lieu thereof to offset the town's cost. That's on the sewer side. On the storm drainage side, those are all evaluated independently. I know the town, there is some detention capacity issues that the town has been trying to address when there are opportunities for redevelopment to increase that storage capacity for stormwater, and that is independent of sanitary sewer flows. So that's examined at both of those levels for any development project.
Jim, do you mind if I add to that? In terms of the downtown recently did a stormwater assessment, because obviously for some of you, I think you may experience some of the flash flooding that occurs down in that area. And part of the reason is that all of, a large majority of the buildings in downtown were all constructed with no on-site retention. And so, redevelopment of these parcels actually provides an opportunity for on-site retention that doesn't exist. So in the, with all of these pre-existing developments, they would just all push their water into the town stormwater system. And so there was very little on-site retention. That was basically what the summary of the study was. And so, I think that the town's engineering department is hopeful that with additional redevelopment, and trying to, like they did with the train station, add more pervious parking, more rain gardens, they'll be able to accommodate some more of that on-site retention. But they did make the point that redevelopment of downtown provides an opportunity for on-site retention where there's none for the pre-existing older buildings now.
So with buildings with no, where does it go?
Commissioner Braun needs to speak into the mic a little bit.
Where does the on-site detention go with new development when there's no setbacks? Does it go under the building?
Under the building. Under the building. So you build engineering with large basins that flows the water back into the ground under the building.
And then there's regarding sewer capacity. This might not relate to what we're talking about downtown, but I know one of the bills being proposed wants to relax sewer capacity requirements so that developers could have their own sewage system, I guess, for that development. I don't know if that would relate to what we're doing downtown, but that.
No, that has to do with septic systems.
I'm sorry, yeah.
That has to do with septic systems. That part of the legislative proposal had to do with septic systems and who had to review up to a certain gallons per day capacity for the septic system. So that didn't have anything to do with town sewer systems.
Were they enabling like a community sewer system for a development?
Those are allowed presently, community sewer systems, but right now there's a gallons per day capacity limitation, and there's a threshold. So if you reach that certain threshold, and I apologize, I haven't worked in a lot of communities where we have a lot of community septic systems, but my understanding is that right now, up to a certain level, you get approved by the Department of Health. If your septic system is over that capacity at a certain range, then you have to get approval through the state DEP, which is a much longer process. So they were trying to increase that from, and I'm going to make up numbers here, from 5,000 gallons per day to, and I might be talking about the wrong thing, whether it's gallons per day or gallon system, whatever, up to 7,500 or whatever that number was, so that the state DPH could approve more of these, as opposed to having to go to DEP where they don't have as much staffing. They're overwhelmed, they're doing other things, and they find that those approvals and those reviews take a much longer period of time.
Got it. Okay. Okay. Do we feel like we've, I feel like we've talked about these variables considerably here and provided some valuable feedback. Mr. Wendt, do you feel like you've got enough?
I agree, Mr. Chairman. I don't have any other additional regulatory proposals to talk about. I think this was a very healthy discussion to just kind of talk about where everybody stands on this. I think I have a much better understanding of where consensus might be, where we might need to throttle back a little bit on some of these proposals.
Yeah.
Just depends on what your desire is going forward in terms of timing. We don't have a privately pending application now. The question is, it's now we have a plan. We've discussed certain elements of it. We can formulate or draft some proposals for your consideration.
Yeah.
Based on this discussion, I think we can at least put some draft language together for your future consideration.
Yeah, I think that would be very helpful. I also think it would be helpful to see some basic rendering is too strong a word of what the building, the streetscape would look like if these regulations, or in generally speaking, the regulations were amended consistent with our discussions. Does that make sense?
I think so. You're looking to see if there's some prototypical visual examples we can give you that tie into the parameters that we're talking about.
Yes, yes. And I recognize that we don't have sophisticated AI computer systems to plug in to do renderings in the office. So if there's any issues there, just let me know. But yeah, I think that would be helpful for everybody to see.
Okay.
Commissioner Braun.
So if we're going into the next sort of phase of evolving this, I would really like to get some feedback from Mark Barnhart on the impact this would have on our 8-30G criteria in terms of 12%. Maybe we should require 15% if we're adding to the density. Are we getting closer to it or farther away from it?
Yeah.
And also, I would really like to hear from the town engineer and maybe WPCA on our infrastructure capacity.
Sure. Those are excellent points. So, if we were to redevelop the downtown area consistent with the regulations that we're talking about, increasing the capacity, increasing the number of residential units in the manner that we are contemplating, how many units might that be? And so accordingly, what impact would that have? Would that need to have on the infrastructure, and can the town infrastructure support that?
Also, as well as climate change, because I think conservation should weigh in on whatever planning we're doing for climate change and flooding and things like that.
Yeah, let me just step back for a second and just talk about overall timing on this. Is that we can start putting some of this together, but I just want to step back and in the reason why we had this plan adopted once we went through this process is this. I think we recognized that it was likely that we might see a private development application come forward ahead of our time schedule to implement certain portions of this regulatory scheme. And we saw that. I mean, this application has been withdrawn, but that's not to say that having this discussion was beneficial should there be another application, but it likely may be we might see similarly proposed regulations, but we're now in a better place to advise such an applicant before we are at a point where we are at the implementation stage on our own schedule. So I just
Yeah,
wanted
no, that's all fair. That's all fair. And look, we had undertaken the TOD studies and the other reviews and the roundtables and everything with a view towards updating our plan of conservation and development, and having that in place as a guide for developers to use as a support for applications to amend the regulations or for special permits and the like. That's been, delayed. It doesn't mean that we can't and shouldn't consider moving forward with amendments to the regulations in the downtown area in tandem with our update. So, I don't know that we need to get too crazy, with the ask. But I think it prudent to understand what first of all, you've got a basis upon which to craft some proposals to amend the regulations. Secondly, some examples of what the streetscape would look like if the regulations were adopted. Thirdly, if they were adopted and the downtown area was redeveloped consistently, how many housing units approximately, what obviously we can't understand whether a developer is going to create, all micro studios or 2-bedroom apartments, right? And the like, but what is the potential impact to the number of dwelling units that could be constructed? And to Commissioner Braun's point, how does that impact our overall the metrics under 830G? And I think the answer to that question drives our further evaluation of how many affordable units to be requiring in this district with these regulations, such that if a developer is going to avail themselves of these these amendments and create 3 stories of residential over 1 story of commercial and reduce parking requirements and so forth, what percentage of those units will we require to be, affordable in keeping with the, the scheme, so that we don't find ourselves taking steps backwards, if you will. I think, and then, the question about the incursion on the infrastructure, I think, is good from water and sewer perspective. But that having been said, if developer proposes to construct something, it's their responsibility to ensure that they can fit within the existing infrastructure. And if they can't, then there need to be improvements. And oftentimes it's the developers that are bearing the burden of those improvements, which is a good thing for the town. So, I'm not terrible. I don't want to get too far over our skis here, thinking that we're going to squelch the whole thing because we don't think we have 12-inch pipes to handle water to feed redevelopment. So I mean that's kind of where my head is. That all makes sense?
It does. I think we've got a good idea of what some of our next steps should be.
Okay.
And I thought it was a beneficial discussion. I thank everybody for their thoughtful consideration.
Yeah,
Mr.
no, and
Corcoran,
thank you for all of your work. Let's
Mr.
go through
Corcoran,
other comments and thoughts before we kind of circle up here. Commissioner Francis?
Mr. Corcoran wanted to speak.
I saw his hand, but you kind of jumped in there first. What's on your mind?
I can't get, there we go. I was wondering, in the TOD study, the consultants predicted what the demand would be for, the annual demand would be for units in the downtown area, and I'm wondering if we're keeping pace with that, or above it or below it.
We are, that was what, 100 something, I don't have that slide in front of me, up to 150 units per year.
Yeah, I'm looking around for it, but that sounds right.
Absorption rate over, for the next 5 years.
Yeah.
We have not produced 150. I mean, the 333 Uncle Road project is a total of 90 units, is really the only sizable project downtown of residential.
That's not done.
It's coming online. I mean, the first phase is being occupied. So within the next 3 to 6 months, I think you'll see that those 90 units pretty much fully occupied.
We have the 830Gs
That's a
coming
very
online.
large development, though, and there's not another one of those.
Yeah, that's 90. The 8-30G on the corner of Rowan, that's 13, 13 units.
And the one by the train station.
The one by the train station, I think, is 23 units. So they look large for their sites, but they're not a large number of overall units. So all in, those 3 units, those 3 combined, although they're not going to be, it's longer than a 1-year absorption period, will be less than 150 units all in.
So we're in the same ballpark, though, of what they predicted, at least for.
Yeah, and I think we're seeing that, reflected in terms of the interest that we're seeing in the market study seems to be accurate because that's what the market seems to be wanting to build.
Right. Okay.
Anyone else? Final comments or remarks, questions? Okay. Thank you, everyone, for really studying the the prior work and the proposed amendments and really participating tonight. And thanks you to Mr. Wendt and Ms. Harrigan for really engaging and putting those materials together. I think we're on a good path. All right. Excellent. Good night, everyone. I'll adjourn the meeting.